Okay, we're working, yes. Thank you, Tessa. So this is, I guess this is my nightmare classroom picture. So thankfully it doesn't really come up much in my experience, which is a good thing. But it is something I kind of worry about, teaching law to business students. And why is that? Because law's got a pretty bad reputation, and I think the kind of words that come up when students think about law are the ones I'm flicking through here. Law's got this reputation for being touch boring, unfamiliar, intimidating, difficult, complex. And I can understand that. I mean, as law lecturers, we deal in big fat textbooks, just scary. We deal in big documents. And the thing about these concerns is they can, I think, affect deep learning. And I think most of us who are here want to be in classrooms which are engaged, which students are taking more than a surface approach. They're engaged in deep learning. They're engaged, they want to know more, they want to learn, they want discussion. We want discussion as lecturers. And all these things kind of are potential obstacles to that kind of approach of learning and the kind of classroom that we want to achieve. So Tessa approached me and we talked about some things that I do, and today I just want to talk about briefly 3 or 4 things, and I say 3 or 4 because time-based, see where we get to, what I do, why I do it, and what effect, if any, those things have had. And I was talking to Tessa and I was saying, well, some of these things are a bit trite and maybe a bit dull, but she said, maybe not, so we'll see how we go. So the 4 things I had in mind. First off, introducing a course. The second thing, linking the course content to current events. The third thing, which has always been a big thing for me, is utilising what I'm going to call the dead zone in the class, the first 5 minutes, and then utilising props. So introducing a course. So this is a picture of a cat's eye. When I come to teach intellectual property, and this was the intellectual property book, by the way, just an introductory text. Intellectual property is an unfamiliar subject for most of our students. It's pretty much unfamiliar for anyone outside of the law, and unfamiliar for lawyers most of the time. So I think I'm working up against some potential roadblocks for students to be engaged in the subject. So what I do is I start the course with a little narrative. I'll show you on the top. I don't really expect you to read this, but it's more to show you. I normally put this in the course book, but students don't always pick them up in time, so I always make sure that I print off enough and bring them along. So this is a little narrative about cat's eyes, and it's actually inspired by the true inventor, Mr. Percy Shaw, who came up with these, came up with cat's eyes, watching a cat run across the road. And at the end of the narrative is a series of questions, and I've kind of changed them from year to year. And the point of these questions is really for the students to imagine a world without intellectual property. And then to think about why we have intellectual property law. So it's really getting at the theoretical justifications for the law. And I normally hand that out, and I get students to fill in answers to those questions. Then I get them to talk with their neighbour, then in a larger group, and then come together as an entire group and talk about their answers. The next thing I do is I collect all those answers and I go through them and I sort of pull out the major themes that students come up with. And for me that's really useful. I get to kind of know where students are coming from, their kind of prior knowledge, and also I'm able to put forward, and most of the time they will get the kind of underlying themes of intellectual property. And so this sets up a nice theoretical framework for the entire course. So students then can understand the why behind a law, and that sometimes can really help them grasp the details of a particular law. If they've got that kind of really good understanding of why we have a particular law, it's a really kind of, I find it a powerful learning tool for them when they come to reflect on other cases. And so we might pause later down the track and think, remember when we talked about Percy, we talked about that utilitarian argument about why we reward people who invent things. Well, perhaps reflect on this when you come to this particular case, for example. So that's what I do. I do it not only for that kind of doctrinal help, but I also do it to set some kind of expectations about what the class is going to be like. Because this exercise at the very beginning gets people talking to each other, as a group, as a class. That's now set the standard, or my expectation for the rest of the class. And so that kind of behavioural trigger is perhaps the greatest benefit of this particular exercise that I've found. How effective it is, I'll get back to, because I want to contrast that with something else I do for a different course, employment law. So in employment law, I start off with a survey. And this survey is designed for students to respond to these statements. And the statements are designed to reflect particular theoretical perspectives on employment and labour law. Basically, we're talking about a unitary perspective or a pluralistic perspective on employment. And some students will have done management, so they're well aware of these kind of theories. So I get them to do it, fill it out, then I get them to swap their neighbour and mark each other's survey. And then I get them to work out whether they're more towards a unitary perspective or a pluralistic perspective of employment. And then I'll sometimes get them to stand. So let's see who's positive in terms of a unitary perspective, and try and get everybody to see and gauge where the class sits on different perspectives. And it's pretty fascinating from my perspective, because you think in a business school we might be a particular kind of perspective, and I'm always constantly surprised by where the class fits. And this is really useful from a subject matter perspective, because the first thing I'm going to talk about is the Employment Relations Act, which made a break from the previous legislation, which was definitely of a unitary character. And so I can link, again, this introduction to the course, to the subject matter, and students, I find, then have a good entry point into thinking about the bigger themes in employment, and that can help them understand some of the specific details as well. And in 1 year I've actually taken that a bit further. I've invited members of the then EPMU union along, and members of the Employers and Manufacturers Association to debate a proposed change on employment law. And these representatives naturally inclined towards different perspectives on this kind of legislative change. And I've been able to link that debate and that survey to this exam question, which asked them to think about the perspectives and think about linking those perspectives to arguments for or against a particular change. The effects of both of these interventions in terms of introducing a course. I think the employment one's been really successful. It gets people thinking. I get emails from students that's really positive straight after the first lecture to get people thinking that kind of way. So the employment one's been really successful. It's easy to administer, it's quick, it's efficient. The one for intellectual property, so when they're thinking about a world without IP laws, a little bit more difficult, really, really hard for students to imagine a world without those kind of laws, and they come in with kind of different preconceived notions, and I don't always get the kind of responses I necessarily hope for. It doesn't always bring out what I kind of am hoping to get, so it's a little bit more unpredictable. But again, I think from a behavioural point of view, in terms of setting the scene for the kind of class that I want, it's been very successful. So that's introducing the course. The next one I want to talk about is current events. And again, I think this one's kind of trite, but found it to be something I do quite often. And I thought I'd just bring along one that was kind of targeted today. So at the beginning of every lecture, for some subjects, not all of them, but for some subjects, I will put up on the document camera a newspaper article that will relate somehow to what I'm going to talk about. Can be tricky sometimes, but not impossible. So if I'm talking about employment, we had a great one earlier this week. Of course, people are going to take a sick day on the Monday, or this one from a IP perspective, or something that happened last year in terms of the yellow pages. So what I find, because I'm always there early, setting these things up and putting it on the document camera, students do read them. I can see them reading them. And some will get there, some students are always early, right? Some students always attend, they're there, they're reading it. And then the first thing I'll talk about will be relating that particular newspaper article to what we're going to talk about. And I have to say, it's just universal the positive effects that has. So one of the things in terms of creating a deep learning environment for me is always relevancy. How is this going to be relevant to me now, to me in my future business career? And I think students show when they fill out the course evaluations that this intervention is really helpful for them in terms of finding relevancy in terms of what we're talking about. Okay, the third thing I want to talk about is the dead zone, and I've kind of already talked about this a little bit because I've been talking about these newspaper articles that I put up at the beginning of the lecture. So for me, it's always seemed like a waste of I guess space or time in those first 5 minutes when students are coming in. Plus, I have to keep reminding myself that my students aren't just taking intellectual property law; they're taking a bunch of other subjects, maybe 3 or 4, and they might be rushing from one lecture where they'll be talking about management or accountancy into my lecture, and then we kind of expect them to switch on straight away. And so for me, that dead zone is a time to kind of flip the switch for students, to get them in the zone in terms of their thinking. So in addition to newspaper articles, or alternatively, I will normally run some recaps. So sometimes I put these recaps on a timer. I haven't done this here, but you can put a timer on your PowerPoints so the slides are changing every 30 seconds or so. And sometimes they'll be really substantive, like the one I've got up on the slide now. So this is real nice details of law about a particular legal doctrine. Other times I'll be talking about kind of terms, kind of word association. What did we talk about last time? Have you kind of got these words? Do they make any sense to you in terms of what we were talking about last time? And then, as earlier presentations have intimated, students love practice questions. They love to know what past exam questions were like, so I might put this at the end. Again, students start thinking, I see them because I'm there early all the time watching, reading the slide and having a go. And the other thing I do at the beginning of a lecture is I nearly always try and play music, and I've experimented heaps with this, and I kind of got lazy eventually, but I used to, for intellectual property, I used to play a song like this one. Hopefully this will work. I used to always play a song. Where there'd been some kind of allegation of copyright infringement. And then I'd ask the students to say, well, what was the result in that case? This one, if you're wondering. And now it's one of this one. Australian case, Men at Work released their song, Down Under. Been around for years and years and years and years. Then someone playing an Australian game show put Men at Work, Down Under, up against Kookaburra Sits in the Old Gum Tree, and then suddenly there was a lawsuit and it was found to have taken a substantial part. It was a copyright infringement case. So I used to play these songs and get students to post up on Cecil as it then was, or Canvas now, what the result in the case was, who won, and again that was kind of interesting for them, I think. Also for employment law, I went on this bit of a spree of playing work songs at the beginning of the lecture. Not many work songs though, when you come to think about it. That's because I think musicians don't have real jobs, so why would they write about working? And now I just play kind of what I feel like. But again, I think, for an afternoon lecture, makes a big difference, and I know a lot of people do play music, but for me, it also is really effective in terms of neuro-linguistic programming, right? So if I've got stuff on the slide or on the document camera, and I'm playing a song and I know exactly when it's going to finish, because I know how long the song is, the moment it stops, silence in the room. Or I can, if that's not working, and it never does, never really had an experience where it hasn't worked, I can put the volume up really quickly, and then suddenly you've got the room. It's kind of that switch, and I find that really effective. And so if I'm feeling really picky, I might have the slides on a recap, and they're on the revolving round, and then the music stops, bang, straight into the lecture. Okay, so I think I've just, in terms of effects, again, really positive. Students like recaps, from what I can see. They talk about it being useful in terms of information retrieval, and also breaking up the content, I think, a little bit, particularly for law, which can have that reputation, as I said at the beginning, as being rather dense. Okay, the final thing I wanted to talk about is props, because I'm a big fan of using props whenever I can. These are a picture of my son's Spider-Man shoes, which you might think what the relevance of that is, but I did need to talk about merchandising in one of my lectures, about the use of fictional characters on merchandise, and so that came in really handy. I've done this one a couple of times. I have to talk about patents, and patents are big, dense documents, very technical. But I found a patent about a bottle opener. And so I used to bring along different variations of bottle openers. And this one, you can kind of see it's got a longer lever, but it's got some other stuff about it as well. And so I'd take student volunteers to open a bottle of wine in front of the class. I know what you're thinking, no, we didn't drink it afterwards. But the whole thing about this patent is it enables you to, in theory, open a bottle of wine much easier. So that process of getting a student to open a bottle of wine in front of everybody, using an old style wine steward, really sort of enabled them to see what was inventive about this patent. The other problem is, it's pretty hard to get bowls of wine with corks in them anymore. So I think you either have to go really cheap or really expensive. And the other thing that's helpful for props is sometimes you have to deal with very boring stuff. It's maybe boring for us as lecturers, right? So the product safety standards, children's nightwear and limited daywear having reduced fire stand regulations sounds like a bucket of laughs, right? But I had to talk about this, and how is this relevant to students? Well, maybe not relevant to students, but it's relevant for me because I have a young family, and so I was able to bring along the pajamas that I bought the week before, and suddenly it made sense what these labels were all about. And I think it made sense for the students too. And that, I guess, is time. I think. Questions?
This isn't so much a question, Rob, as a comment. At our lectures, I'm going to generalise because we're at the beginning of the year, generally they all arrive early. They're probably 20 minutes to half an hour early, and they use that for setting up time and discussing and socialising. This is quite a good idea. I used to play music, which was relevant to the topic, but you've given me some other ideas about things that I could use, so very helpful for me.
Your presentation was too good.
Or too bad, you know, it goes either one way. Yes.
Are there anything else that you're thinking of experimenting on, I guess, or trying something else? Or, I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, how did you come up with all these things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of what's talked about in terms of, I mean, I'm just talking about 4 things that I do, but I do a number of other things, I suppose, and I'm a big fan of using the exercises, and I do those in my lectures. So for me, problem-based learning is really helpful for law, so putting problems at the centre of the learning experience. So I do that. I also do a bit of Socratic method. Yep, and again, it's about creating that environment where that's going to happen, because I've set the scene early. So I will give students cases and pre-prepared questions, and I will expect them to kind of answer it, and I will kind of go around the room and kind of not really pick on, but kind of pick on people to get those answers. Just creating an environment where it's kind of more active.
Okay, I think we're all done. I think it proves my case, though. None of that was trite, because we're all probably going to nick loads of those ideas, which is one of those. So thank you very much.